Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is perfectly reasonable to challenge the views of select committees of this House. It is neither eccentric nor indeed rare. So I should like to start with some of the things that I think are most contentious within the report, bordering on erroneous. We may turn to paragraph 48 to start with. This makes reference to the fixed penalty notice received by Mr. Johnson for the birthday party. And it seems to think that the fixed penalty notice is in fact an admission of guilt. But Lord Chief Justice Thomas, in R.V. Hammer, said this: "It is quite clear that the issue of a notice is not a conviction. It is not an admission of guilt, nor any proof that a crime has been committed. The scheme of the Act makes that clear. Any person reading the form would plainly understand that it is not to be regarded as a conviction, and will not be held against him, save in the respect mentioned. It seems therefore clear, both as a matter of the statutory scheme and as a matter of what a person accepting such a notice would reasonably be led to believe, that he was not admitting any offence, not admitting any criminality, and would not have any stain imputed to his character." Yet this report, against what a Lord Chief Justice says, against what is a principle of our criminal law, decides to impute a stain upon his character. It seems to me that this is quite clearly a deliberate attempt to take the most unfavourable interpretation that the committee can of Mr. Johnson's activities. But this is not the only contentious paragraph. Let us go to paragraph 83. Paragraph 83 decides as if it were an Elon Musk particle to insert itself in the brain of Mr. Johnson to work out what he must have thought at a particular moment. Well, I'm glad to say that, as far as I'm aware, Mr. Johnson does not have one of these little bits stuck in his brain for the committee's benefit. So when it says that we conclude that Mr. Johnson is unlikely to have been unaware, as an obscure use of a double negative to try and impute malfeasance to somebody where they cannot prove it.
Absolutely.
They want to assume something, they want to impute something because they want to come to a particular conclusion. Of course I'll give way to my...
Does he not also agree that the very word disingenuous, which is used in the context of this report, is also in the same category as those things that he just mentioned?
Well, I entirely agree with my honourable friend, and I would refer him further, if we go on in this report, to paragraph 82, on the line to take. Now, Mr. Johnson, as Prime Minister, was advised before Prime Minister's questions to say that the rules had been followed at all times. And this report goes into great detail as to what was the authority for that, who had told him, were they senior enough, was that right? But they don't ask, were other ministers given the same briefing? Was this the cross-government line to take approved, as far as I could be aware, by all the officials? Well, I can tell the House that prior to business questions, for the weeks when this was at the forefront of public interest, the briefing I was given was that the rules were followed at all times, with the at all times emphasised. The only reason I didn't say this to the House is the Honourable Lady, the Shadow Leader, never had the wit to ask me the right question. But if she had, the line to take was absolutely clear as a cross-government line. And yet this report concludes that the Prime Minister was not advised, as he then was, by senior enough people, that they were involved in the press office. Well, the idea that ministers aren't advised by people who work in communications for them shows quite how long the opposition has been out of government, not to understand this. And then based on this, seems to me, tendentious reading of the facts, we come to the sanction, a 90-day sanction. Well, a vindictive sanction, it seems to me, which they can't implement because Mr. Johnson has left Parliament. So they go from the vindictive to the ridiculous, with not allowing him a parliamentary pass. Well, of all the trivial sanctions you could impose on somebody, that seems to be the most miserable. But they emphasise that this sanction, and let us turn now to paragraph 229, that this sanction has been made more savage, more brutal, more vindictive, because Mr. Johnson impugned the committee and undermined the democratic process. On what basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, is it thought that this House, when it comes to a conclusion, must be obeyed? Is it the case that we must not criticise the Dangerous Dogs Act because it was passed by this great and noble House? Or are we in fact allowed to criticise as a fundamental of free speech that which happens to us, that which is reported about us, that which is said of us? When somebody is in court, they are allowed to say that the court has made a mistake. And the protections of courts, of the junior courts with juries sitting in them, are quite rightly very strict. But you can still say that the court has got it wrong. Indeed, you're allowed to say it's got it so wrong that you may go to appeal. You don't have to kowtow. But for some reason, the Privileges Committee thinks it's in communist China and that we must kowtow. And then they go on to say that Mr. Johnson was complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee without one single solitary shred of evidence. It is pure assertion. Now, this, I think, leads us on to the issue of partiality. Now, I was most intrigued by the response to my intervention by the Right Honourable and learned member for Peckham, because she said she'd told the government and it all been approved, and that was fine and dandy. Well, may I refer her to paragraph 12 of her own report, which says that the report would have as its guiding principle being transparent. So suddenly we discover in this transparent approach that there was a secret agreement that her involvement was all right. Well, I was in the government at the time. I never heard that this had happened. And so it seems to me that it is important to examine the position that the Right Honourable and learned lady found herself in, which I notice the committee does not do in Annex 1. Annex 1 purports to answer Appendix 3. Now, I'm sure you're all listening and following very carefully. Appendix 3 is the letter of Mr. Johnson in response to the draft report. But fascinatingly, although paragraph 6 on page 100 questions the impartiality of the committee, Annex 1 ignores that. It answers lots of other points, but it brushes over this point, perhaps because it thought that it was on relatively thin ice. Of course I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful. He obviously called for me to resign or to recuse myself from the committee. Did he ever ask the Right Honourable Member to recuse herself from the committee before Boris Johnson started demanding it?
Said it very publicly, and it's a matter of record that I said it. I said it publicly. I assume people are aware. People clearly are aware of what is said publicly, because I will come to paragraph 14 in due course. But the issue here, no, I've given way to the Honourable Gentleman. That seems to me to be sufficient. Now, in paragraph 9, the report says that we leave our party interest at the door of the committee room. And that is all very good and to be encouraged. But it doesn't meet the Hoffman test. And why do I think the Hoffman test is important? Is because the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, like the Privileges Committee, was a committee of Parliament following a judicial, or in this case, quasi-judicial process. And what is the issue at here? And I quote from the judgment: the contention is that there was a real danger or reasonable apprehension or suspicion that Lord Hoffman might have been biased. That is to say, it is alleged that there is an appearance of bias, not actual bias. The fundamental principle is that a man may not be a judge in his own cause. This principle, as developed by the courts, has two very similar but not identical implications. First, it may be applied literally. If a judge is in fact a party to the litigation or has a financial or proprietary interest in its outcome, then he is indeed sitting as a judge in his own cause. In that case, the mere fact that he is a party to the action or has a financial or proprietary interest in its outcome is sufficient to cause his automatic disqualification. The second application of the principle is where a judge is not a party to the suit and does not have a financial interest in its outcome, but in some other way his conduct or behaviour may give rise to a suspicion that he is not impartial. That is the fundamental point. And that led to the Judicial Committee overturning a decision that it had made for, I believe, the only time in its history. It is a reasonable suspicion. If we take the judgment of Lord Nolan, which runs only to 4 lines, I will read out only 2 of them. I would only add that in any case where the impartiality of a judge is in question, the appearance of the matter is just as important as the reality. And this seems to me to be fundamental, that the Judicial Committee followed a proper process which the Privileges Committee did not. Now, I've slightly exceeded your time limit. I will finish relatively swiftly, but fortunately the previous 2 speakers were brief, which is encouraging. Let us come to I won't give way. Let's come to paragraph 14 on the special report, because this is important, and the report quotes in paragraph 194 the 1978 resolution of this House that its penal jurisdiction would be used sparingly in order to provide reasonable protection for the House, its members or its officers from improper obstruction or attempt at or threat of obstruction causing or likely to cause substantial interference with the performance of their respective functions. This does not mean criticism. It is absolutely legitimate to criticise the conduct of a committee, to criticise the members of a committee. That is politics. Our politics is adversarial, and that, I believe, is one of the great strengths of our political system. It is open to us within this chamber to accuse people within the bounds of good order of saying things that we disagree with. Outside this chamber, freedom of speech is paramount. We are allowed to say what we like. The House has historically tried to call people to the bar, indeed in past times, and even imprisoned people, and it made the House look ridiculous. When John Junior was called to that bar of the House because he had said in the Sunday Express that members were fiddling their petrol coupons, it was not John Junior who looked ridiculous, but the House. And we must defend the right of freedom of speech. And frankly, if politicians cannot cope with criticism, you wonder what on earth they're doing with a political career. Yeah. And I have one final question from Annex 1, Section 7, where it says that Suze Gray's report was not important in this case. Well, it seems to me that when the witnesses have come from Suze Gray's report, it is odd then to say that her report was not important. And it might also be interesting to know, in the interests of paragraph 12-style transparency, quite how many communications, private and public, the chairman of the committee had with Sue Gray.
Here.